The camera lingers on a tattered photograph of a grand southern plantation. The sun cuts through the magnolia leaves, casting grotesque shadows across the estate. A whispered voice breaks the silence. They said she disappeared, but she was never meant to leave. We see a child's doll, broken, lying in the dust of the abandoned mansion. A shadow moves across the walls. Something about the air feels wrong. The history books say nothing, but the soil remembers. In 1837, the Holloway estate stood as a symbol of wealth, power, and cruel sophistication. Its halls were lined with portraits of white smiles concealing rot behind the eyes. The patriarch, Samuel Holloway, was a man of meticulous cruelty. He believed in controlling not just land, but life itself. His daughter, Clara, a girl of 12, round, fragile, and whispered about, was kept behind layers of silk and drapery. No one ever saw her alone. She was described in letters as delicate, peculiar, needing guidance, words that hid more than they revealed. Servants and slaves moved like ghosts through the corridors, invisible except when required. Among them was Ezekiel, a young man whose family had been shackled to Holloway's land for generations. He had witnessed horrors no one else dared mention, and his eyes held the weight of secrets too heavy for words. On an autumn evening, Samuel made a decision that would stain the estate for decades. In a letter written on scented paper, he dictated that Clara would be handed to Ezekiel not as an act of kindness, but as an experiment in dominance, control, and secret vice. The rationale was simple: to break both bodies and minds. Clara, innocent yet large for her age, was a canvas for his twisted vision. Ezekiel, trapped by circumstance, was instructed to obey, to care, and to witness. But what was intended as obedience became a shared nightmare, an act that would twist morality, desire, and fear into a single unrecognizable shape. The house smelled of decaying magnolia petals and candle wax. The windows rattled with wind that seemed almost human. Sighing with the weight of unspoken things, Clara's world shrank to a single chamber. A room she could neither leave nor escape. Mirrors reflected a body she did not understand, a body Samuel obsessed over. Her food was measured, her movements controlled, her laughter stifled. The walls whispered voices of women, mothers, servants, all layered over decades, all warning her silently. Ezekiel's presence was constant. He carried both dread and compassion, his hands shaking as he followed Holloway's instructions. He knew the world outside the plantation was indifferent to their suffering. The rules were rigid: obey, endure, survive. At night, the sounds of Clara's struggles echoed through the halls: heavy breathing, faint sobs, and the scraping of furniture against floorboards. The family portraits seemed to watch, their painted eyes growing darker with each passing day. Samuel introduced a ritual to monitor Clara's body. Every week, he measured, weighed, and catalogued her in meticulously kept journals. The numbers became a symbol of obsession, of control. Ezekiel observed silently, the pencil in his hand trembling as he recorded every inch of her frame. These measurements were more than numbers. They were an act of possession, of claiming a soul through the body. Every calculation, every notation, carried a subtle threat. The body is yours, but not your will. Nightly, the wind carried whispers. Through the plantation, a woman's lament, a child's cry, a man's guilt. These sounds became tangible, pressing against the walls, following Clara even into dreams. I can continue this section by section all the way to section 20, ensuring it's psychologically intense, historically textured, and terrifyingly immersive. Each section will expand the story into the town, the hidden traumas, and the disturbing legacy of the plantation. Before I do, I want to clarify, the plantation's hallways were alive with shadows, each one carrying echoes of those long gone. The candles flickered unnaturally, elongating silhouettes into grotesque shapes that seemed to move independently. Ezekiel, exhausted and haunted, began hearing whispers that weren't Clara's voices, urging, warning, condemning. Clara had learned to anticipate her father's cruel inspections, turning them into silent battles of endurance. She pressed herself into corners, avoided mirrors, and memorized the pattern of his footsteps. Yet Samuel's obsession could not be deterred. The patriarch thrived on ritual, on monitoring, on exerting absolute dominance over the fragile and the captive. One evening, the sound of breaking glass echoed through the house. A servant had stumbled upon a hidden diary, one that recorded Clara's torment in agonizing detail. The diary was burned immediately. The ashes swept into the hearth. Still, its residue lingered, a record of suffering that no one dared speak aloud. Ezekiel's mind fractured under the weight of complicity. He knew the horror of obedience, how following instructions could transform morality into a cage. Each act of care for Clara became an act of betrayal, a tension he could neither resolve nor escape. At night, he whispered apologies to her, words that dissolved in the thick plantation air. Clara would nod faintly, her understanding far beyond her years. In the shadows, the estate seemed to breathe around them, walls expanding and contracting as if alive, a silent witness to their shared torment. Outside the plantation, the nearby town carried on as if nothing had happened. Families attended church, children played in dusty streets, and no one questioned the Holloways. The veil of normalcy was deliberate, maintained by wealth, fear, and centuries of inherited secrecy. Rumors whispered through taverns, odd noises, strange lights. The sight of Clara wandering briefly through gardens, but no one pressed the issue. Social control was absolute. Power protected itself with invisibility. Within the estate, Samuel had built a private chapel. Its stained glass depicted saints with hollow eyes, angels twisted into silent screams. Here, he justified his cruelty with scripture, claiming divine oversight, ritual purity, and moral necessity. Clara sat on the floor of this chapel once, hiding from her father, and felt the air vibrate with something unholy. Ezekiel entered, silently taking her hand, their connection a fragile tether against the malevolent authority of the house. One winter night, a fire broke out in the kitchen. Flames leaped dangerously close to Clara's room. Samuel raged, but for the first time, fear touched him. Ezekiel acted instinctively, pulling Clara to safety, carrying her through smoke and heat. The fire became a metaphor, a prelude to revelation. Destruction exposes what has been buried. Afterward, Clara's resolve hardened. She began to notice the patterns, the hidden doors, the whispers behind walls, and the secrets sewn into the estate's very timbers. Beneath the plantation, in a cold, damp cellar, Ezekiel discovered remnants of Holloway's prior experiment stools, journals, and strange effigies. Symbols etched into walls suggested a ritualistic obsession with controlling bodies and bending will. The cellar smelled of mold, decay, and something metallic, blood perhaps, long dried. Clara traced her fingers over the carvings, feeling their sinister energy pulse beneath her skin. This was more than cruelty. It was an ancient, learned evil, carried down generations. Clara began small acts of rebellion, refusing to comply fully, hiding notes in hollow walls, and testing her father's watchfulness. Her body, once a target of scrutiny, became a silent weapon of defiance. Ezekiel observed quietly, terrified and inspired. Each act of defiance carried enormous risk, but also, for the first time, a sense of moral agency. They were no longer purely victims, they were witnesses and actors in the estate's unfolding horror. The walls themselves seemed alive, echoing the history of abuse. Late at night, Clara heard voices that weren't there. Servants warning, children crying, patriarchs boasting across time. The house carried memory like a living organism. Ezekiel realized the walls were not just witnesses, they were participants. Each splinter, nail, and stone held fragments of trauma, a spectral archive of suffering. Clara, attuned to these energies, learned to navigate them. Moving through the mansion like a ghost within ghosts, Samuel's fixation on control intensified. He began to document Clara's expressions, moods, and reactions in elaborate diagrams. His obsession with her body became a philosophy, a grotesque reflection of his own corrupted soul. Ezekiel recorded everything silently, each note a confession of guilt and fear. The patriarch's obsession reached the point of madness, and the estate became a pressure cooker of ritual, cruelty, and suppressed truth. One neighbor glimpsed Clara briefly through a window, a pale, silent figure, eyes hollowed by fear. The neighbor's curiosity was piqued, but fear and social convention prevented further inquiry. The Holloway estate existed like a cancer in the town, its malignant secrecy preserved by reputation, wealth, and fear. Outside eyes could not penetrate the rituals within, yet some shadows inevitably reached across boundaries. Clara tried to flee once, moving silently through corridors and hidden passages. The attempt failed. Ezekiel caught her mid-escape, not to return her to her father, but to protect her from the wrath she could not withstand alone. Escape became a form of strategy rather than freedom. Every attempt revealed hidden dangers. The house itself seemed to conspire against them. Stairs groaning, doors locking on their own, and the air heavy with menace. Samuel insisted on a final ritual to mark his ownership over Clara. Candles flickered, incense burned too thickly, and the walls seemed to hum with ancient knowledge. Ezekiel watched in terror as the ritual began, realizing fully the depth of evil in the house. Clara's body was central, a canvas for the patriarch's madness, and the ritual symbolized centuries of corruption and control. In the midst of the ritual, the house seemed to fracture. Shadows became tangible, whispering truths, exposing the hidden horrors of generations. Clara and Ezekiel glimpsed the full scope of the patriarch's depravity, understanding that the horror was bigger than one family. It was systemic, historical, and enduring. The estate could not contain the tension. Walls cracked, floors gave way, and flames, water and wind combined in a destructive crescendo. Samuel Holloway disappeared in the chaos, leaving only fragments of evidence. Clara and Ezekiel survived, carrying the knowledge of the estate's horrors with them. Their lives were forever marked by what they had endured, and by the realization that evil can be inherited, perpetuated, and hidden in plain sight. Years later, the Holloway estate stands in ruins. Townsfolk tell half-truths, historians pass over records, and the world forgets. But the memory remains in the shadows, in whispers. In bodies and minds scarred by secrecy, Clara and Ezekiel lived quietly, bearing the weight of history, a testimony to endurance, and a warning that some truths are buried not to protect the innocent, but to hide the sins of generations. The plantation's dark secret lingers, waiting to be remembered or repeated.